Good afternoon, sir. Can you tell me your name and your profession?
Yes, my name is Kenneth Moorefield. My profession currently is that I work for the Department of Defense. I'm a Deputy Inspector General. And before that, I was a career Foreign Service officer with the Department of State. And before that, I was a military officer.
Wonderful. Sir, were you involved with Vietnam in what year and what would you do there?
I arrived in Vietnam in 1967 in late spring, early summer. I was assigned as an advisor to the 21st ARVN Division in the lower Mekong Delta in Long An Province. And my regiment, the 32nd Regiment, was based in Kamau, which was the capital of Long An Province. I think it's been renamed now, but in any event, it was Long An Province then. And I was there fighting the war with the Vietnamese Army until April of 1968, when I was wounded in a battle that we had on the outskirts of Kamau.
So as an advisor role, what do you do?
Well, attempted to support our Vietnamese Army counterparts, especially with air support, tactical air support, helicopter gunships, medical evacuation, resupplies, but also to give advice where we thought military advice would be helpful. We didn't have any American forces fighting in that part of the Delta. Well, there were a few Special Operations Forces teams, but by and large we were fighting on our own, as it were. So aside from the advisors to the division, it was just the Vietnamese Army in that part of Vietnam. So we didn't have joint operations with other U.S. forces or other allied forces. So anything we could do to help in the fight, help win the war.
So you train them?
Yes, we did some training, particularly when we were able to provide new weapons capability, which we did, and I helped them learn English also, I might add, which at their request gave English classes. But this was a battalion that had been fighting for many years, but when I got there, they were very experienced. They had taken a lot of losses in the past, casualties, but I think they were a very professional unit, and we had a number of successes during the time I was there.
So what kind of weapon do you equip at that time for personal?
Yes, me personally, I carried a .45 caliber pistol and an M2 carbine, which was a weapon from the earlier stages of our military fighting capability. But during the course of my time there, we were able to get some more advanced weaponry to help them fight the war more effectively. M60 machine guns, in particular, were very important. And so they essentially had earlier stage U.S. weaponry, except for when we got the M60 machine guns that turned out to be a very key element. Frankly, helped us win a couple battles that we might not have won otherwise if we hadn't had that capability. I might add that the Viet Cong were well equipped also, so I'm not sure we had any significant weapon superiority on the ground, but when we brought in air support, that's when we could really overwhelm them.
So what year was it? Do you remember the ARVN start having M16 instead of carbine and Garand?
Well, the M60 machine guns were not issued to the battalion. I was able to make some informal arrangements to have them provided to the battalion, and we trained them on their use. So I really, since we fought the war pretty much on an isolated basis, usually I didn't see any other battalions, and I didn't see advisors to any other battalions. We were in our own various somewhat isolated areas of operation. The Long An province is actually huge territory, and so 32nd Regiment was trying to cover an awful lot of fighting land, terrain, and so I really didn't have any visibility over what they received. I suppose if something significant would have happened, I might have heard about it, but I just went out and got the M60 machine guns, let me just say, and I didn't steal them, but I borrowed them legally and made good use of them.
So, but in your opinion, the southern of Vietnam at that time very much under control of ARVN, and we see really, under control.
No.
Nothing.
No, we didn't have control really.
Yes.
I think that largely the Viet Cong infrastructure, intelligence network, influence on the population was very significant in the lower part of the Delta where I was. I was almost down at the tip of the Kamau Peninsula, so no, they had a significant influence there, going back to the wars, against the French and the Japanese, the U Minh Forest, and it was a significant sanctuary for the Viet Cong. They were able to mount operations out of the U Minh Forest with relative impunity. They had tremendous support from the population, frankly. So I think it was very difficult to say that the government or the ARVN really controlled too much terrain, except for the terrain that we were sitting on at the time. I can't account for the rest of. Did I say Long An province? I meant An Xuyen province. My gosh. I also fought in Long An province.
Oh, wow.
I'll tell you about that later. That was the next year. But in any event, so it was An Xuyen province, and I think it's been renamed now to maybe Kamau, something like that. Maybe they took the capital of An Xuyen and made it the entire province. But in any event, so no, I think we had great difficulty operating because there was so much support for the VC.
I see.
You're gonna
Go ahead, sir. Can he say something before we put on?
Well, I can do it on camera, whatever you want. I just want to point out that I thought that the 21st ARVN Division was very effective, however, as a fighting force. So if you distinguish between what the ARVN's fighting capability was, which I thought was very significant for the 21st ARVN Division, versus how much of the territory was controlled by the government. That's the distinction I'm making here.
So I interviewed many Vietnamese who live in that area, and they said that daytime, ARVN and American very much under control, but nighttime here come VC come in, and so they have to live double life very much. So you see that.
Yes, I think that was very much the case. I think that it was very difficult on the population. That they certainly had to at least appear to be cooperative with the government and the ARVN during the daytime, and the nighttime they were vulnerable to Viet Cong, so if they didn't cooperate and support them, then they were going to be abused.
Thank you, sir. Do you have anything to share during that time? Because I will move to the next day, which is the very last days of present in Vietnam, which is close to April 30th, 1975. before we go to that period of time. During the time of advisor, do you have anything else you remember you want to share?
Well, I think I would just point out one thing, that I was wounded in April the 10th, I think, of 1968. But within only a few months, the battalion commander, Vietnamese battalion commander, and the deputy battalion commander, who had become battalion commander of another battalion, but both of them were killed. The reality is that there were quite a few fiercely fought battles, and so amongst the officers, I think it was hard, to have a long life as a serving infantry officer in the 21st Sergeant Division. And so, in a way, I was kind of lucky I got shot, because I always used to walk just next to the battalion commander, and the way he got killed, I think I probably would have gotten killed too. But so, there was a lot of sacrifice.
So, where you got hit?
I was shot through the arm.
So you have scar on this thing?
Yes. Went in here, came out here, and I was lucky I didn't bleed to death. Fortunately, I didn't, as you can see. And but we took a lot of casualties that day, and so we were able to bring in a U.S. medical evacuation helicopter after a long time, because there was a tremendous fight going on. They had quite a few battalions on their side. They had attacked us in this offensive, which we called the Second Tet Offensive, in April of 1968, and which was quite, I think, in a way, a surprise, because we had killed so many BC and Tet that we thought that it wasn't possible for them to mount another offensive, but they did, and it was quite intense. So there were many casualties in my battalion, and Vietnamese. I was the only American casualty that day. The following day, another infantry battalion advisor was also shot, and he ended up in the same hospital as me up in the north. But so we were evacuated. I don't know, there must have been 8 or 9 wounded Vietnamese soldiers on the helicopter with me. We ended up, I think, in Soc Trang, where there was a medical evacuation hospital.
So this is a personal question. How do you feel when you got shot? I mean, was you scared? Or are you thinking of?
I wasn't scared. I was in tremendous pain, but the worst part of it was that I couldn't breathe. My lungs collapsed, I think, from the shock of it. And I was standing in my waist up in a canal, at the time, a rice paddy that was filled with water up to, my waist. So I thought I might drown, since I couldn't stand up. I was kind of fading away. It was not a happy experience. Fortunately, they managed to pull me out and put me out in the rice paddy. And
How old was you at that time?
How old was I then, anyway? That's a very good question. I must have been 23 probably.
So very young man.
Yes, but I was lucky. I was lucky I didn't bleed to death, and I was lucky that the bullet was not a few inches to the right. It would have gone right through my chest. But anyway, it was a memorable experience.
How long it take you to heal everything?
It took actually quite a while, because I had an operation in Vietnam in the military hospital. Then I had another operation in Tokyo, Then I had an operation in Walter Reed Hospital, Washington. I don't know. It's hard for me to remember. It must have been 3 or 4 months where I could use my arm more or less effectively. But it's still crooked. It always will be crooked, because I can't. I
Does
lost.
that hurt? And you feel hurt sometimes?
No, not there. My shoulder is what hurts because my arm doesn't work right. But down here, no, because I don't have much of an elbow left, so that part's okay.
So it look like you injured seriously. You could, do something that you don't have to come back to Vietnam. Why you choose to come back and you face with all the battle? Why?
That's an interesting question. Well, the war was not over for me, I decided. So when I got well, they gave me an opportunity to come back. Basically, they said, we're going to send you back, but even though I realized medically I could have probably avoided going back, but I wanted to go back. I wanted to be a company commander. I wanted to fight, and the war. I wasn't finished with the war, or the war wasn't finished with me.
So I know you graduated from West Point, so you have a very strong mind about serving the country. But on the other hand, the same age, young man same age like you out there, standing on the street yelling, stop the war, stop the killing, stop this and stop that. What make you, West Point, beside West Point, what make you to have the conviction to, serve the country and help South Vietnam?
Well, that's what I was trained and educated to do. That's part of it, okay? I came from a military father. My father was an Army officer. He fought in World War II. So I came from a military tradition. In any event, I was educated and trained at West Point to be a military officer, and certainly believed that I was better prepared than most of our soldiers to have to fight that war. At that time, there were many of us who felt that, if our country needed us, that we should be willing to serve and to fight, and if necessary, even to die. There were those who didn't agree with the war or didn't understand the purpose of the war, couldn't see their way to sacrifice, and so I didn't resent, their position. I didn't feel that somehow they were being cowards or unpatriotic. Mostly, some I think were just afraid. Of course, war can be a fearful thing, particularly when we were taking a lot of casualties, as we did as the war progressed. But I, by and large, I didn't bear any ill will towards those who avoided the draft or even fled the country. My belief was that if your country needs you, you need to be willing to fight. Now, I was not ignorant of the situation in Vietnam, of course. I had studied at West Point to a certain extent. I certainly was aware that there was a struggle going on for the future of the country between the communist-led forces in the north and non-communist south. Also at that time, we were concerned about, we were strategically concerned about what would happen if South Vietnam, fell to the north, and what the impact would be on the rest of the region. So I think at the time, there was not just my perception, but I think we had a strategic perception that South Vietnam was important, And after I had gotten to know the people and the country, I came to identify with them, not just as a political entity, but as a country with people that wanted to live their own lives their own way, and that was worth fighting for. So maybe I was fortunate in that I started off fighting with the Vietnamese army, so I got to know them and their cause and their convictions.
Can you elaborate it about Vietnamese people? You got the opportunity to work with them, talk to them, and understand their needs, their will. Can you share a little bit about? And then maybe that helped you think that what sacrifice you made there good work.
Well, I've never questioned any sacrifice that I made. I mean, I felt it was my duty to do what I did, and therefore I don't regret that. I regret only one thing about the war, and that was that so many of the servicemen and women that fought there, were not treated well when they returned to the United States. That I regret deeply, and they didn't deserve that, and the kind of treatment they received had sometimes a very negative psychological impact on them and their ability to adjust and become, part of American life again after having served their country and sacrificed in Vietnam. As far as the people are concerned, you need to remember something about my experience with the Vietnamese people, because not only did I serve as an infantry battalion advisor, but I came back as a U.S. diplomat, foreign service officer in 1973. So I spent 2 years during that period as serving in Saigon and also in Nha Trang. And I came to know the people and the culture, and then I came back in 1995 to help open the embassy. I opened offices in both Hanoi and in Saigon. I don't call it Ho Chi Minh City, in Saigon.
Thank you for that.
So yes, I came to admire the people and their culture and their fortitude and resilience and strong spirit.
So I need to go back a little bit, because I got you as officer in the southern of Vietnam, Cà Mau. I need to ask you that North Vietnamese army, they violated the ceasefire in 1968, and then they attacked many cities. Was it the city you been at that time got attacked? Can you tell me about that?
Yes. So when the attack began, it just coincidentally, my battalion was we were based in Cà Mau. So it just so happened that we were not out on an operation. We were there the night that they attacked, and I think we were not totally unprepared, but not as prepared as we probably maybe should have been or could have been. I'm not sure, but because there were people leaving Cà Mau the day before. They were getting in their sampans and going on a vacation, which seemed like a little excessive even for Tet. So I think there certainly was some indication amongst the population that there was going to be an attack. Anyway, they attacked with significant force during the night. We only had one battalion there, and plus there were the province chief had certain forces and the police, but nothing nearly the capability that they had.
How many battalions they have?
I don't know, it was a multi-battalion attack, and you know, it's hard for me to say. I'm sure it had to be at least 3 or 4 battalions. And the reason I say that is because I was engaged in the fight in different parts of the perimeter of the city. So there was at least 1 battalion that attacked the battalion headquarters of my battalion, and we had, I'm not sure if we had every company there at the time, but that's, by the way, where those M60 machine guns enabled us to fight off the what probably would have been the loss of the battalion headquarters. And if we lost the battalion headquarters, they would have just marched right into the center of the city, because that was one avenue of approach into the city. So in any event, it was a long night and a long fight, but the following morning, they had not taken over the city, and we brought in tactical air support, and they did not have a withdrawal plan. Apparently, what we subsequently discovered is that they had their leaders had planned on victory, and so they didn't have a withdrawal plan, but it cost them dearly, because the next day when they didn't control the city, then we came in and brought some serious air power support against them. Many were killed.
So directly, direct the attack instead, and he said that they come in with 3 purposes. First, they attack and then got people uprising at the stronghold that you explained to me, that they got a very good support from population at your area. But you see any uprising people during that time?
No, there was no uprising. I think people were just trying to, protect themselves and their families. Unless, of course, they were part of, the Viet Cong infrastructure in some way. I mean, if they had a role, of course, to play, they played that role. One of the things that happened during Tet of 68, which was strategically very important, or at least it could have been in terms of the outcome of the war, and that's that substantial amount of the Viet Cong infrastructure, support base that was quietly there amongst the population, surfaced in order to help the fight. So in that sense, the population rose up, but there wasn't population that was converted suddenly overnight because they were attacking. They've been part of the VC support effort all along, but they were either killed or wounded or identified, and that substantially set back their whole effort. If we had been able to follow up on that advantage, created on the battlefield, I think it could have been a major turning point in the war. It did not turn out the way they had planned.
They totally lost in that war.
They lost in Tet of 68.
Wonderful. So now it's time for, you want to drink some water?
Yes, please, thank you.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, it was an opportunity to make money.
A little piece of paper on little page.
Yes, what a pity. But the church got rebuilt, that's wonderful. Congratulations on that. And the villagers are able to now worship.
Yes. So tell me about when you come back as a diplomat, what brings you back, and what brought you back, and what you see?
Yes. Well, I went to graduate school at Georgetown University after I got out of the Army, and so in 1973, in the spring of 1973, I met Ambassador Graham Martin, who had just been appointed as our ambassador there, and he asked me to come on his staff and accompany him to the embassy in Saigon, and So I left graduate school, or I left after my first year in graduate school, and agreed to come join him and support the effort of the embassy. We had still hopes and aspirations to create a non-communist South, try and stabilize the situation and prevent a North Vietnamese takeover. So I went back. Thought it was I still had a strong sense of duty with respect to serving there and supporting our effort.
So at that time, from the book and from people were telling me that the time for peace talk negotiation in Paris, at the embassy over there, you have any activity related to that? Or if so, can you tell?
No, because the peace talks and the Paris Peace Accords were negotiated in late 1972. So essentially, the peace accords provided the opportunity for us to, move forward. At least that was the principle, that we were going to be able to move forward in a, peaceful accommodation with the North, and between the North and the South and the United States government. So when I came, or we arrived, we arrived in July of 1973, so the peace accords had been signed. Unfortunately, the peace accords included multiple North Vietnamese divisions remaining in the South, which I think strategically, in hindsight, was not advisable, because already the South was on the defensive because they had this military force literally in their backyard. But in any event, we arrived in July the 10th. That was my birthday, so I remember it, 1973. And I began my foreign service career in Saigon.
That's the next question I want to ask you. Peace accord in Paris signed by 14 countries for country directly involved: United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and Mekong, and many other countries as witness or at whatever role, 14 altogether. And in there was a clause saying that nobody can violate. But at the time that, during that time until Saigon fell, numerous violations from North Vietnam. Do you recall that the embassy in Saigon do anything in nature of raising, the awareness of the violation from the North? So any country in those 14 countries who have their signature there do anything about it?
Well, part of the Paris Peace Accords was the establishment of the International Commission of Control and Supervision, which was supposed to monitor the ceasefire and the implementation of the accords on the ground. And so there were 4 countries included in that. If I recall correctly, Poland and Hungary, and I think it was Canada and Indonesia, but in any event, the Indonesians left. They were replaced by the Iranians. In any case, at one point in my service there, between 1973 and 75, especially, I think it was close to the end of 1974, I was assigned as one of the liaison officers from the embassy to this International Commission of Control and Supervision. And so I became familiar, with their work, and yes, there were many reported violations of the peace accords. the way the International Commission, however, was set up, there was no sanction ability that they had other than to report that the accords had been violated. And so we were aware that that this was a situation on the ground. I don't think there was any lack of awareness. I'm not sure there was a great amount of international recognition or concern. Frankly, thinking back on it now, I was, just involved day to day, trying to keep track of what was going on through the Hungarian and Polish delegations were, of course, not our friends at that time, and they were not our friends on the delegation. So information that we received was through the non-communist members of the delegation. And they were powerless to do anything about it. And even if they could do something, wanted to do something about it, the Hungarians and Polish delegation, would neutralize those efforts, kind of like veto, if you will, in the Security Council of the United Nations. So, these violations were, they were, how should I say it, small scale violations, and they were probably, it was easy to overlook them, and in any event, unless you were going to take really significant counterbalancing measures, it was hard to stop them. And then there were complaints registered regularly, I think, with Hanoi, but just didn't have the same leverage as we did when we had our own forces on the ground. Talking about in 1975?
No, I'm talking about 1973 when they attacked on numerous Long.
Yes. You mean when we intervened with our bombing force and neutralized the attack, fought that attack back, yes. Well, it was a commitment that we had made to the government of President Tu that if the North attacked in force, that we would intervene, and that we would intervene again as we had in late '72, which helped bring them to the table, I think, and agree to the Paris Peace Accords, because but they certainly attempted to take over the South then. You're right. I think the commitment that we had made, which was not a transparent agreement, but it was a commitment nonetheless that President Nixon had made. It's my understanding that if they intervene again, we would once again intervene, using significant Air Force power. But the President Nixon, of course, had to leave office. So that commitment, was a commitment that he'd made, but it was not a formal commitment in the sense that the United States was, politically committed to carrying that agreement out after President Nixon left office. At least that was the political calculus perception in Washington.
So I interviewed Ambassador Buizim, you may know him. He was telling me about his hopeless effort of getting Congress sign some aid, or President Thieu even asking for a loan so that he can have money to support his troops in South Vietnam to stand until hopefully something else come up, but it was not a successful one. When you were in Saigon, embassy, you see everything crumbling, in front of you. How do you feel about that? And especially one of Americans, you see that like South Vietnam about to be abandoned. If I use the word wrong, correct me.
Yes, well, in the fall of 1974, I was serving as a political military reports officer in the consulate in Nha Trang, which we called Military Region 2 previously, but anyway, in Nha Trang. So, in that position, I was responsible for visiting 12 provincial capitals, and we had reports officers in each of those. And so I was able to track, what was happening and follow the indicators that we had that the North was preparing some kind of attack. I mean, they were clearly building a road network in from the west of Pleiku and Kontum and Van Me Tuot, from the west of those provinces east into the country to facilitate movement of forces into the country. And at the same time, as you pointed out, our military supplies were dwindling, and President Nixon had to leave office. So it was a worrisome time. I think our ambassador tried to do whatever he could to persuade visiting congressional delegations to continue to support the effort. I think that the lack of military supplies had a direct impact on the ability and willingness of the South Vietnamese forces to fight. That was the other problem. At the same time, you had the North and supported by the Viet Cong, pushing forward, but in a subtle way, but nonetheless positioning themselves for an offensive. The South Vietnamese forces were receiving less and less munitions, and therefore they were less and less aggressive in terms of their tactical operations. And while I was there, just as an example, there was a ring of bases, South Vietnamese Army bases around Kontum and Pleiku, and the North Vietnamese attacked. I mean, we're talking about a regimental size attack. I mean, not just a company of local forces, but a regimental size attack. And they attacked this battalion size operating base that was in that sort of circle of defense, around, I think it was Kontum. And so it was a very ominous indication that if they were willing to launch regimental size attacks, this was in the fall of 1974, that they were clearly preparing for an even bigger offensive, in the future. And these bases were, essentially wiped out. Okay, so I went up there to Kontum and we talked to some of the survivors of the attack to understand, the extent of it and how well organized it was, and it was clearly very well organized and effective, and they just eliminated that base and killed many of the South Vietnamese forces there. But the thing that was preoccupying was that they were so bold and so aggressive to make these efforts, these tactical efforts that were successful, and yet the South Vietnamese did not have the capability to respond and counteract them in a meaningful and strong way. So they were probing operations, but those probes certainly determined the lack of capability in the South Vietnamese to counteract them. and I'm sure further emboldened them, encouraged them to prepare for the offensive that they ultimately launched in 1975.
Yes. I also interviewed some South Vietnamese army officer. He was talking about the latest battles, like kind of gas.
They didn't have hand grenades, they didn't have bullets, they didn't have gas, they didn't have enough to be able to fight the war. I have to say it was a terrible situation.
And also I interviewed former North Vietnam, communist officer, and they said that their plan was to capture the South in 1976, which means that it's another a surprise for them when they come down, and then they don't have much resistance.
Yeah, I think I'd heard that before, that they moved up their timetable when the offensive in 75 exceeded their expectations. And it's hard to say exactly, why it was so successful. I think part of it had to do with a lack of confidence in the South Vietnamese military that they were going to be able to stand up to a full-fledged offensive. And that confidence or lack of confidence probably came because they lacked the supplies that they needed. But I think it was also apparent that we were not going to be supporting them any longer. And so when they launched the surprise attack against Bang Mi Tuot and then moved north to Con Tum and Pleiku, you know the story of what happened subsequently when they tried to withdraw down that long road to the coast and with their families, I might add, and got slaughtered. And then, things began falling like dominoes in the north and in the central region and then further south.
So at that time you was there and you see all the domino falling down. What the atmosphere like in the embassy, U.S. embassy at that time? Can you describe for me?
Well, I think there were a range of views and emotions because most people in the embassy were not aware of what the intelligence situation was on the ground, the operational situation. So, it's not like you could get the newspaper and read about, the disaster of the withdrawal from Con Tum Pleiku. Only the most, literate in Vietnamese language or those who had access to the information could understand what was happening. So, and in addition, at some point, the embassy was beginning to withdraw and evacuate families. And, they were trying to get, we were trying to get everyone out of the country that wasn't crucial to continuing the operations of the embassy, and it was a huge undertaking. At one point, I think there were 10,000, maybe, is one figure I heard, U.S. civilians in the country. So, in any event, there was a major effort to try and begin getting them out of the country after, April 3, March, after Tet. Maybe beginning as early as the end of February, certainly by early March. So there was a lot of preoccupation about who was leaving and families being separated and who was going to stay behind. And, the reality is that, we had very limited capability to make a difference in the fight that was going on. We had the ability to gather information about what was happening, and report that information. But I don't think the capability of our administration in Washington, they didn't have the support by and large, of the American people. They didn't have the support of the Congress. So we were not going to send in any additional forces, and we didn't, frankly, at least I didn't expect that we would. My focus increasingly became what could be done to, help facilitate an evacuation.
As you just said, that is the evacuation may start as early as late January. So.
Well, I don't think we called it an evacuation. I mean, it was a drawdown of the embassy personnel, what they call the, there's a phraseology for it, non-essential embassy personnel and their families. Because people had families there too, of course.
I also heard that the U.S. didn't have a plan to move Vietnamese, but rather to their personnel and then also family. Is it right? Was it true?
That's a very interesting question. To what extent did we plan to bring Vietnamese out of the country? I was not privy at the time of the attack in Military Region 2 in the Kontum Pleiku area. I wasn't aware of what plans the embassy had or the U.S. government had with respect to South Vietnamese civilians. So I'm not gonna say, because I just don't know. What I do know is that in late March and early April, when I volunteered to stay behind and support, whatever actions needed support, I became aware that we were planning for an evacuation of course, all U.S. personnel, of the Vietnamese that worked for the embassy. And then at some point, I was asked to get more deeply involved in April and help prepare for the evacuation of what Washington called high-risk Vietnamese personnel. And so I needed to know about this, otherwise I wouldn't have known about it, because they asked me to go out to Tan Son Nhut, to our military facility there, military command, Vietnam, MACV. Anyway, to our facility there and set up a consular processing organization that could determine which Vietnamese would qualify under the criteria that they had provided us. And the criteria came from the Department of State. And as I recall, I can't remember all the specifics, but I think there were like 6 categories of Vietnamese, and depending on their relationship to American citizens, whether they were spouses or sons or daughters or family connections, there were a whole range of categories, up to and including high political risk, people that had worked closely with us and were likely to be identified for retribution by the North when they took over. So that's when I became aware that yes, we did have a plan, and the plan was, to somehow they had to get onto the air base and then to the evacuation center, but to process them, and if their credentials met these criteria, they were able to demonstrate that they met these criteria, then I and my team would give them the documentation that they needed to get on the aircraft, the C-130 fixed-wing aircraft, to fly to Guam or, Philippines or wherever we were flying, the refugees to, or what were about to become refugees. They weren't refugees then, they were citizens, but soon to become refugees.
How many went through your office there, your organization you set up in Mexico?
Yeah, it's a really, we didn't have time to keep records. Let me just say that. So I can only tell you that it was definitely in the thousands, because we operated for about 10 days, day and night. It's just impossible for me to, I'm just be guessing. I would be surprised if it was any less than 10,000. It was probably more than that, but I can't remember how many more. As I recall, the numbers that were evacuated from the country, or that managed to get out of the country and onto the fleet, the Navy fleet, U.S. Navy fleet offside, were about, in other words, that came into the refugee camp system and ultimately to the United States, were about 47,000. So of that number, certainly a percentage came through, this consular evacuation process. In addition, Vietnamese were able to, residents were able to, or Americans related to them, were able to go initially to the embassy itself. But of course, it was very difficult to get to the consular section of the embassy. The lines were all the way to the palace. And I think they did their best and they worked very hard. There was tremendous effort made, but they didn't have quite the capability that we had to process people. So the total number that went through those processes, I really can't say, but I certainly know it was in the thousands, could have been in the tens of thousands.
So we end up to have about over 130,000 people out there. So can you tell other channel that they can get out and you know, we end up with over 130,000. So besides went to your, office, where else can they find out and they can get out?
Well, any way they could, of course. Boats, planes. I think, as you know, the fleeing the country did not end with our departure. On the morning that I got out to an aircraft carrier by helicopter off the roof of the embassy, we still stayed out there, the fleet still stayed out there for another day, and as people were coming out by boat or by aircraft, helicopters. So we were still absorbing people before the fleet departed for the Philippines. But as you know, for many years afterwards, people continued to flee the country mostly by sea. So when you think about the total number that actually came, it continued to grow, although not as quickly as we brought them out initially.
So I like to have some detail because it makes opinion. Somebody said that because of Ambassador Man, slow down the process so more people can come, and yet some other people said, well, we didn't want to evacuate anyone at all. That's why we cannot more people out. You in there, you see everything. You with Ambassador Man. Can you tell what happening about those days?
Yes. Yes, I can try and answer your question, but no, I'm not sure I can answer what was in Ambassador Martin's mind. I think he had a well-based fear that if we initiated an evacuation of our own personnel too quickly, that the regime would collapse, okay, immediately, and it would precipitate, final takeover of the country, and also could lead to significant loss of life on the part of embassy personnel, and not to speak of the Vietnamese that we wanted to help save. So his logic, as I understood it, was that we had to wait to begin the evacuation until it was absolutely clear that there was not going to be any chance that the South Vietnamese army could turn around the offensive. All right, because even though the northern and central regions fell fairly quickly, in military region 3 and 4, it was a more protracted battle, and it was not immediately apparent that they would capitulate. Even though, as you know, Da Nang and Trang, I mean, these were really scary, how quickly they fell, and the panic that ensued, and so, and that was part of his calculus, and what influenced him is we could already see what had happened up in Da Nang and in points to the south. When things collapsed, they collapsed like that, and suddenly, the soldiers threw away their weapons or pointed them at you, but anyway, they were concerned about themselves and their families, and that was it. There was no more fighting. It was just jump on any airplane you can and grab any means of transportation you can and try and flee, right? So, if we had started the evacuation sooner, maybe we could have evacuated more personnel. But would it have precipitated an attack against Saigon sooner? As it was, we were attacked. I mean, Saigon was attacked. Our facilities were attacked. I was out at Tan Son Nhut on the afternoon of the air attack by the pilots that had commandeered, aircraft from, I think, from Phan Rang Air Base. But in any event, so we were getting bombed right there at Tan Son Nhut, and then of course that night they launched our rocket attacks on the city, and they were trying to drive us out and terminate, the evacuation or any further military operations of any sort, rescue operations. So no one can ever say with certainty that how many more we could have saved, or if we started sooner, or what the consequences would have been in a negative sense if we had started sooner. In other words, maybe we only got the time that we were going to get, to do what we did, which was about 10 days. And I don't know, I didn't have a crystal ball, but my gut feeling was we were going to get about 10 days, to run that evacuation center, and it turned out I was more or less right. And I based my calculation on, something pretty basic, how quickly they seem to be closing in on Saigon. So, it seemed to me that we just had to assume that they were going to get there on more or less along that timeline, and take all the appropriate precautionary actions that we could.
Yeah, at that time, like you said, in the Fall Corps, people didn't expect that Saigon kind of fell that quick, and many.
No.
Yeah.
No, I think it was hard in 3 Corps and 4 Corps to realize how quickly the 1st and 2nd Corps had fallen. I mean, it was hard for them to understand how dramatic and how forceful and how swift it had been, and how devastating.
So I interviewed some of the soldiers who were with the general who killed himself, committed suicide in the last day of Saigon or next morning, like the general Mekong. And later I interviewed General Lim Dao, who fought the last fight in Long Khánh. And he said after his fight, he gone to the south and tried to find, General Hua, and they meant to, fight back, and hopefully they can do some, good. But everything dismantled, and when he got there on the first, General Hoa Nam already killed himself, also Lê Văn Hưng and things like that. Do you think that at that time you have any contact or any general or anything, or you just concentrate on the evacuation? Nobody contact embassy to ask for any help or any advice or anything?
I can't really answer that question with any confidence. I will tell you that I had some ARVN military officers that tried to leave through our evacuation process. Not generals, colonels, but not many. It seemed to me that most of the senior officers, from what I understood, were fighting as long as they could fight. But I have no idea what was going on, to tell you the truth, at the embassy, and I don't know that contacting the embassy would have been, frankly, very helpful at that point. What they needed was military support, and we weren't capable of providing it. We'd already made that decision before, after the attack, but before, the last 10 days or so. So it was too late. It was too late to militarily reverse what was happening. The only thing left was how many people's lives could be saved.
So I'm curious about the atmosphere between you and then between embassy and President Nguyen Thieu. Very much that, not forced, but he very much would his hand tied out, and he had to resign on the 16th of April. During those days, what was the atmosphere between government and embassy over there? Of course, they hopeless, and you cannot help, and because decision be made in Washington D.C. How you, when you contact, what it like?
I cannot give you an insightful answer to that question. It's a good question, but I think that once the decisions were made, that he was going to resign, then it was just a question of really. Let me just say this. I was a second secretary, so you have to understand. I'm out there at the, getting ready to go to the airport. I was already working, with the consulate, and so my focus was more how quickly the North Vietnamese army was going to arrive in Saigon and how many people we could ultimately get out of the country. But I think the intention was to try and create a regime after President Tu that, and I think Big Min, as they used to call him, was the preferred sort of neutral candidate, who would somehow be acceptable, as an interim government to, the North, and that somehow we could negotiate, a transition period that might lead to a joint third force and South Vietnamese, the remnants of the South Vietnamese government coalition. That, of course, in retrospect, seems highly unrealistic expectation, but it's my understanding, and I wasn't directly involved, but that there were efforts being made along those lines within the embassy. But you know, it's pretty hard to negotiate from a position of extreme weakness, and that's the position we were in, and the position the South Vietnamese government was
Can you describe for me the last day you were in Saigon? How were you to sit on that rooftop, and what were you doing, what you feel like at that time, what was going on?
in. Well,
What day was it?
it must have been, yeah, okay, I hope I get this right, all right, because we're going back a few years here. So I haven't been studying my history book to get ready here today, but if I remember correctly, and I can't be off by more than a day, and I may be actually right, but let's say it was the evening of the 29th, all right? The afternoon of the 29th, they attacked the air base, all right? And we were processing refugees. I had several hundred, you know, at that point, inside this perimeter, you know, where the post exchange, you know, and commissary had been. So we had this perimeter, if you will, there. That Marines had been sent in from, I think, from Tokyo, but in any event, I think there must have been at least, let's say, a platoon of Marines that were kind of surrounding this area to provide some protection, because there was an ARVN Ranger regiment sort of on the flank, one flank of it, and I think there was some concern that, you know, maybe they were going to come in and try and, you know, get on aircraft or whatever. Of course, I might add, when they bombed the air base, they wiped out the air evacuation because they bombed the airfield, and so it was not possible to use it for any more C-130 aircraft evacuation. So we were really shut down at that point for that part of the evacuation. And so I stayed there until late that night. We actually served food to several hundred. All these Vietnamese, we served food. It's kind of, you know, humorous in retrospect. We broke into the commissary supplies, and I found some, you know, ex-military cooks, and we cooked up, got the kitchen open, and we fed all these people. So we did something right that day. But ultimately, you know, I figured I better get back to Saigon, because I, you know, better get back to my apartment and get ready, you know, for what was going to happen next. And so I got a car, staff car, and driver, and drove, you know, back into Saigon. And there were a few checkpoints, military checkpoints along the way, but they let us through. Everyone was on high alert, needless to say.
What kind of clothes you wear, I guess?
I was just wearing civilian clothes. I mean, I was a civilian, right? So, you know, I was probably wearing khaki pants and khaki shirt or something like that, you know. Nothing too eye-catching. I was not trying to gain anyone's attention, but, you know, just casual clothes. But anyway, so when I got back to my apartment, which was across the street from the Grawl Hospital, remember the Grawl Hospital? In any event, I hadn't been there very long when they started rocketing the city, and, you know, one of the rockets landed right down the street. I think it went through the roof of the Majestic Hotel. It's only a couple blocks away. It sounded like it was coming through the roof of our building. Anyway, at that point, I realized I couldn't stay in my apartment, you know, because I think I was on the top, you know, floor, which was maybe only the second floor or the third floor, but anyway. So I began to prepare for, you know, how to get out of there, and I don't know how I did this, to tell you the truth. I cannot remember. Somehow I managed to get to the embassy. That's all I remember. Maybe I walked. I don't know. I got to the embassy and I got in touch with our security office and arranged for a car and a driver, and I don't know, maybe someone came with me. Someone must have come with me. I don't know. I wonder what they thought I was doing, but anyway, I wanted to go back out to the airbase because I knew we had all those refugees there, right? And so the question was, well, how are they going to get brought into the evacuation process, because essentially they were a prisoner there. There was no place to go. They couldn't get on an aircraft, and there was no one from the embassy to, interface really, I was afraid, enable them to get on the helicopter evacuation, because one phase of the helicopter evacuation was going to be on this athletic field that we had on that military compound. So I got out there, and they were still rocketing the base. I remember, because we ended up in a ditch, trying to seek cover, because these rockets were still landing. Anyway, somehow we got in through the front gate and drove over to the secure area, and where the refugees, I keep calling them refugees, the Vietnamese citizens who were about to become refugees were sort of awaiting their fate, and the Marines, were there. And during the course of the night, a rocket had landed on the perimeter that the Marines had set up, and 2 Marines were killed, and I think they were the last 2 that I remember being killed, American military personnel being killed in the country. Although we lost some helicopter pilots when their helicopters flew into the South China Sea during the evacuation. But in any event, so I made some arrangements. I don't know what arrangements I made. I think what I discovered was that I had some colleagues from the embassy that were there that could basically ensure that these Vietnamese got on, the helicopter evacuation, and they did, ultimately, that I'm assured of. So I went over to the military headquarters, command headquarters, and learned that they were trying to organize convoys to go pick up Vietnamese citizens and some Americans too. I mean, press, personnel and others that were still there in the country at various sites around Saigon. And it was not well organized. I don't understand what happened, to tell you the truth, and I never stopped to find out. All I could see was that they didn't know where they had to go, and they didn't know how they were going to get there. So I commandeered some buses and drivers. One of the drivers was a Vietnamese I remember I found in a ditch, on the edge of the military base, and I asked him if he could drive, and he said, yes, so get on the bus, you're a driver. I had another bus driver was an American officer from the embassy. I was very proud of him, you're an officer, do that, it's a pretty big thing. So anyway, we took off, and we started picking people up at these various sites around Saigon. And unfortunately, I tried to bring them back to Tan Son Nhut when I had my buses full. And by the time I got back there, and by then, I didn't know the exact time, but in any event, all I remember was that the air police on the base would not let us get back on the base. And I had a rather ugly encounter with this, young Air Force, Vietnamese Air Force officer who drew his .45 weapon out, because I was trying to insist that we really need to get back there he was insisting that I couldn't, and he had his orders and et cetera. So, you know. So we went back to Saigon, which was, falling apart at that point. People were, in a panic, driving all over the place, trying to find some way to get out, and it was really a scene. So I still kept trying to, pick some more people up, but I wanted to take them to the embassy. Well, I didn't know where to take them, really, to tell you the truth, because I didn't have any instructions, but I went down to the docks to see if I could get them on the, the barges there, but the barges were, had people hanging off the ends of them. And so, also we were running out of gas. And I found where one of the gas, resupply points was located, and got some gas, but there wasn't going to be another opportunity, to go back and get more gas. I could tell that. And already I had so many people on these buses that I had to stop at some of these sites and turn down, people I couldn't put them on the bus, including some people that we really wanted to, help. High-risk Vietnamese intellectuals, academics, people that were going to be vulnerable, unquestionably vulnerable, right? Seen as collaborators or intelligentsia, or people that should be done away with in some way, put into a re-education camp for a long time. So ultimately, it was becoming late afternoon. It was getting increasingly dangerous out there because these soldiers were former soldiers. They were running around with weapons and commandeered vehicles, and looting was beginning, and it was getting ugly. So I got as close to the embassy as I could with the buses, and I couldn't get all the way there. So, the people on the buses, maybe we got within a block or two, but they had to get into the embassy from the backside over that fence there. They did, and I knew some of the people I picked up were American reporters, and they managed to get, into the embassy. I finally got into the embassy, but I got through the front gate, I convinced the Marines there to hold the crowd back long enough for me to be able to get in. So that was kind of the end of that phase of my participation in the evacuation, and then things segued into what ultimately became the sort of end game, if you will. And during that rest of the evening, I didn't have any specific responsibility. I remember hanging a set of lights up on the roof of this garage so that the helicopters, because they were going to have to come into the courtyard of the embassy, during the evening hours, at night, but we didn't have enough light for them to be able to see the courtyard. So I guess I was the only one that was agile enough and willing to climb up there and put those lights in there. And so I put the lights in, but that was, about the only thing I could contribute at that point in time, other than take some phone calls in the embassy and very sadly tell people that unless they could get to the gates of the embassy, there wasn't anything we could do for them anymore. Some of them had U.S. passports too. That means they were married to Americans, probably. They just happened to be back in the country. Yeah, that's a good point, because there were a lot of people that had come back into the country to help their relatives get out of the country, and they got trapped. because they couldn't get out of the country because there was no mechanism for them to do so. And then there were people that were saved by people like Lionel and others, friends of mine, who came into the country to help specific people to get out of the country, and they were able to do that, but they had someone who, could enable them to get through the, various barriers that existed and, get out, get onto an aircraft and get out. So anyway, the air evacuation from the embassy, started and, kept during the course of the night.
How many helicopters involved in that effort?
I don't know, it was continuous, is all I can tell you, although these were smaller, not smaller, they were good-sized helicopters. I can't remember, it's a Marine helicopter, I think it's a CH-53, but in any event, you can put 30 or 40 people on there at a time, seems to me, maybe 25, I don't know, I can't remember the exact number, but we had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, that had sought refuge in the embassy compound, and they were organizing them to get them on each helicopter as it came in. And so I don't know how many ultimately managed to get out that way. I wasn't directly involved in supporting it at that juncture. I was kind of, how should I say it, waiting to see what to do next. And then around midnight, we received a message from I thought it was a message that had come from Washington, all right, but in any event, a message that was taken seriously, that the North was threatening to attack, the embassy if we didn't shut down the evacuation, immediately, and so we had to stop the evacuation, all right, at that point, and move all the Americans into the embassy and seal off the part of the embassy where all the Vietnamese personnel were waiting to try and get out. And by the way, when I say Vietnamese personnel, keep in mind we also had Korean diplomats and Iranian diplomats, and we had people from different countries. They weren't all Vietnamese at that point. Some of them were just diplomats trying to get out. In any event, nothing happened. We waited for about an hour, I remember, and so we started the evacuation up again. I was very proud of our military and diplomatic personnel for doing that. I could have just taken that threat seriously enough that was it. We just took out Americans after that. So we restarted the evacuation, and at this point, we were also bringing helicopters into the roof of the embassy.
That's what, 29th, 30th?
It would have been the morning of the 30th by this point in time, okay? And also, and I wasn't there, of course, so by this point, remember, I'd left Tan Son Nhut, but as far as I am told, and by colleagues that were there, so they were sending helicopters in from the fleet into this athletic field, and were pulling them out, including the Vietnamese, I think, that had been in the compound, when we had gotten attacked by air the night before. So that worked out okay, all right? They took everyone they could, which is to say everyone that was there, because if you weren't there, there was no getting there at that point. You couldn't get on the base. And I don't know how many people that were on the base somehow managed to figure out how to get into that. It's a good question. When I was out there towards the end, there were pilots just grabbing helicopters and taking off. I remember the last time I was on there was a helicopter on its side sitting there with the rotor blade still turning. Someone who didn't know how to fly just tried to fly it out anyway, I guess. It was weird. It was surreal. But in any event, so when you bring a helicopter into a dangerous situation like that, well, on any situation, helicopters do not come in, you know, unless there's an air controller basically there on the ground to bring them in, right? Because, you know, they can't see everything that's going on. They really need someone to sort of guide them in, as it were. And there had been a young Marine up on the roof of the embassy who was doing this. And the helicopter pad was up here, you know, raised above the roof of the embassy, which was here. But it was smaller, of course. You know, it was like, I don't know, it was square, but anyway, it was sitting up here like that. And somehow he had gotten fatigued or disoriented. I don't know what happened, or maybe because of the tremendous air blast of the helicopters when they were landing. But he backed up too far and he fell backwards off the helicopter pad and badly injured himself. And he had to be evacuated, you know, right away because he was hurt pretty badly. So, you know, I had some experience in bringing helicopters in to the battlefield when I was an infantry officer, so, you know, I volunteered and went up there, and I spent the rest of the night on the roof of the embassy bringing in helicopters and observing the madness that was taking over Saigon. And ultimately, maybe it was around 4:30 in the morning, the ambassador and, you know, a couple of his most senior staff decided to leave. They decided to leave because they had to leave. I mean, essentially, we received a message from Saigon from the White House saying, only American citizens from this point on. And I think that was triggered in part by the fact that the fatigue on the helicopters and the pilots was really beginning to take a toll. Already they'd lost one complete helicopter and its crew crashed into the water. And I think they just can't fly continuously like that. You have to stop and maintain them. And then the pilots, there were no replacement pilots really, so they were fatigued. It was getting dangerous. So no more personnel except for Americans were to be evacuated after that. And then they said the ambassador's got to be on the next aircraft. And I went down into the embassy and told him that. And he agreed. So at least he didn't resist. And so, I came up on the roof. I took him across the roof and put him on this helicopter and with a couple other senior officers that were left there. The political counselor and maybe one other senior officer, I can't remember. And so that was the last of our senior staff. And so I can't remember how long I waited after that. It might have been as long as an hour because the helicopters were not coming in as rapidly anymore. I don't know what was going on exactly, logistically. I guess they didn't have as many that were still operating. I don't know. Anyway, there didn't seem to be anything more I needed to contribute at that point. The only people that were left were Marines. And so I thought the Marines could figure out a way to be lifted out by the Marines. So on the next helicopter that came out, there were a few more Americans left. I think the security officer and I don't know, a couple other people, and I just put them on the helicopter, and there was no one else, waiting, and so I got on and left off the roof of the embassy about 5:30 in the morning.
April 30th.
Yes.
So you remember, did the ambassador tell you anything before he flew out with the helicopter?
No. He didn't tell me anything kind of looked at me when I said he had to be on the next helicopter. I'm like, I think he was a little confused as to why anyone was telling him he had to be on the next helicopter, but I didn't take responsibility. I just said, they said you got to be on the next helicopter. Okay, I think he understood that it was probably a message coming from Secretary of State or the President. In any event, no, and we ended up on different ships, so I didn't talk to him then. Next time I saw him was several months later at the State Department, and we didn't talk about it, the evacuation.
So when you took off with the helicopter, you looked down Saigon, how did you feel?
Well, coincidentally, it was dawn, so the sun was coming up, and so I could, it was not up, but it was beginning to come up, so it was getting lighter. I remember as we lifted off, and in the distance, I could see that the MACV compound, which I subsequently found out they had burned, right? They had, put some incendiary devices there and just, burned it down, was on fire. And anyway, aside from that, it seemed, strangely quiet and ominously calm. As if nothing special really was going to happen or had happened. But, of course, I knew better than that. And so, it's actually not that long a ride by helicopter from downtown Saigon to the coast. I don't remember how long it was, but I don't think it was very long. But I was tired, so all I remember is when we got to the coast, you could look out as far as you could see in any direction, and there were U.S. naval craft and all kinds of fishing craft and any other kind of boat that could possibly be out there. It was quite a scene, to see all of that panorama, maritime panorama of those that were there to help and those that were trying to escape. That was kind of my last recollection before we landed on this aircraft carrier, the USS Okinawa. And so that was the end of my operational role in the evacuation.
I want to ask you one more detail. They're talking about April. Christmas, what is it in April? What is it? Why Christmas in April? You know anything about that?
But that was just the warning signal that they were issuing by radio to indicate that, the evacuation was underway. It was just a way of communicating to people without saying there's an evacuation starting now, so I don't know who selected that particular language, White Christmas, but if you had the capability and you had a radio and you were listening to the Armed Forces Network, then you were able to pick up that message and go to where you were supposed to go if you were still there and if you could.
Was it effectively take people out with that sound?
In all honesty, I can't say because I was so deeply engaged in what I was trying to do that all I know is that when I went to places where there were supposed to be people, there were lots of people. Now, somehow they got the message, right? And I think they got it through their American citizen counterparts, whether they were working for them or they were friends of them or associates of them. In other words, they had managed to get to the pickup points. So I think the answer is yes, it worked, but since I didn't have a chance to listen to a radio, I can only assume that it worked or they wouldn't have been there.
Well, so I think that I can imagine that how emotional you got when you were on helicopter leaving Saigon, and did you cry at that time?
Not then, no. I was too exhausted. I hadn't slept very much in the previous 10 days, and I was, really, I was more fatigued than I even realized. 'Cause once the ship got underway, I think I must have slept for 24. All I remember is sleeping all the way to Manila. I got up to eat, but I was just exhausted, so. No, the time to shed tears was really later when you realize what we were not able to do and what we did not accomplish and what we did not contribute. And what had happened to the people that, that were sent away to re-education camps. Now, that having been said, the few of us that were there, I think I have great admiration for what my colleagues contributed, during those very difficult circumstances with the few resources we had. I was very proud of the U.S. military, what they did. It was extraordinary, really, under the circumstances. And so, sometimes I'm torn between thinking, my God, if we could have, sustained our effort in the war longer, or if we had provided enough supplies to the Vietnamese military, or if we had started the evacuation sooner, these things that, maybe could have happened, but the reality was what it was, and it turns out that it was ultimately fatal, as far as the South Vietnamese government and many of its people were concerned. So, and after I got back to the United States, within a month or so, I was at a refugee camp, resettlement camp in Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. So I was then involved in the resettlement in the United States and in other countries. So I continued to work throughout the fall, up until end of the year, trying to facilitate the resettlement process. So I was still involved, still engaged, and in a way, it's, if you've got something you can do to make a contribution, it helps to alleviate, the pain, because at least you can contribute, you can do something. I think the people that suffered the most must have been those that, came back and had nothing to do, no way they could help in any way anymore, but just be concerned about those that were left behind.